There are few things in life that are as humbling as birth and death. There are probably many days when, as inhabitants of this earth, we can go around thinking we have control of the things in front of us. We can make decisions. We can act. We have influence over the scope of where things are going. And sometimes we can even think that we are powerful and it all depends on us. There is nothing that can puncture that illusion like the edges of life and death. There is no way to pretend that we are not mortal when facing birth and death. We've been talking this month about awe. And I'm so grateful for the testimonies that have been shared, the stories that we hold in our hearts, and the wider expressions that also have been shared that I wanted to name today, as Harvey Rothschild shared in Finding Awe and Beauty in the Fields of Korea, Bob Forgrave in the mystic connection of his sister, and I know that there are so many more stories that are here of all the things that stir us with awe, with birth and death, that brings up all those big feelings within us. And so, especially around the edges of life, we know that sometimes those feelings are not just of awe and wonder, but also come with things that are hard. When there are things that we really want to happen and don't. Or there's things that we desperately want not to happen, but do. And so as we talk about these stories today, we hold in a special blessing all those in the midst of grief, those in the ambiguity of wanting a child, or grieving what might have been. It is so tender to not have control over the things that matter to us. These transitions in our life are a part of what it means to be human. I'm going to break it to you. Every one of us was born one day. And this one may come as more of a shock. But every one of us will have a day that we die. It is mind-boggling in ways that our own life is finite on this earth, that one of those things that we know but not consider directly, because when we picture how perilous this is, how vulnerable, is it any wonder that those lives or rooms on the edges, the veil feels thin? What can put more in perspective our own vulnerability on this earth and those that we love? And what ways can it feel more holy than that? I lead a lot of memorials. Really, I'd be happy to do fewer. But I realize that means that my job is also literally probably someone's nightmare, because I'm regularly asked to combine death and public speaking. When someone has passed, however, I always want to do the memorial, because it is such a holy thing to do. It is such an honor, and it is a gift that I do not take lightly. It is a gift to be in a room that is that important. Those rooms at the beginning of life and death, it is right there in the middle of the things we call life, with all the complicated messiness that is family and friends and relationships and history, but it also calls into high contrast the things that matter. And where we can find kindness and love and humility, that we love each other deeply as mortal beings. How beautiful and vulnerable is that? The scripture from today is from Paul's letter to the Romans. And the letter itself is spending a lot of time laying groundwork for a new community following Christ in Rome, who Paul hasn't met yet. And he's trying to lay out the Christian faith and what it means to be followers of Christ. And in this section, he's trying to talk about a community that is mixed, that is a mixed community of both Jews and Gentiles, and some folks that are following the Torah and some that are not. And so we have some that are eating only vegetables to be certain they're avoiding meat that's sacrificed to idols, and then some are eating meat because there's only one true God after all. And I know it may take a moment to say, how can a community get itself wrapped over knots about this? But trust me, it was a thing. And what Paul is trying to say is what is essential and what is not. And here he's amazingly naming that the things we call religious are non-essential. That what are the holy days and what laws do you keep sacred, how you gather at the table. The important thing is that you are doing them with an intention of doing so before God and not what those particulars are. And so he ends, therefore, with this line that whether we live or die, we belong to God. That in our living and in our dying, we belong to God. In thinking about life and death, even those things that were of heated conversation, of utmost struggle and community, they're suddenly put into perspective when you put it before life and death. Somehow it looks different. I was reading this book, and it's called Death is a Day Worth Living by Dr. Ana Claudia Gitiana Arantes, who is a doctor in Brazil who's been active in increasing access to palliative care and hospice. And she writes, "Nothing is more sacred than being there for someone who is dying, because there will be no next time. Regardless of what faith you profess, whether you embrace it or not, you only die once in this life. There is no rehearsal. So I talk to folks about the stories we have around death itself. Often, folks want to tell the story of who was there in the room, who was there when the person passed, of who couldn't be there or who had just stepped outside for a moment, making meaning out of these places that feel holy, that tell part of the story of the person with reverence. For birth, there can be stories of awe and wonder, and if you are a person who gets to meet a brand new human, it is a gift. You also can't plan a miracle. It's pretty much the definition. And so if you are thinking about your stories and saying that there is ambivalence or ambiguity or exhaustion, or that things were just plain hard connected to a death or a birth, You aren't doing it wrong. There is no reason to add shame or unmet expectations as burdens on things that are by their nature really hard. And I also want to give space and story for the holy that can meet us there. If awe is when we're faced with something that is bigger than us and that changes our perspective on life, our births and deaths are moments that sometimes our perspective changes. Sometimes our whole world is changed. Annie Dillard shares in her book on writing, write as if you were dying. And at the same time, assume you write for an audience consisting solely of terminal patients. That is, after all, the case. What would you begin writing if you knew you would die soon? What could you say to a dying person that would not enrage by its triviality? I think of this quote a lot. Honestly, because I have to write for you all every week. And I know just a glimpse of all the stories that are being held by folks here who are gathered. The love and the joy, the grief and the promise that each week we are holding things that matter here. And so what are words that we can speak into this space that hold things that matter? For those who are spending time waiting for a birth or in rooms where you are waiting for death, there's sometimes a surprising amount of time on your hands. If something is outside of your control, it is often that there is time to wait in labor. And sometimes there is time along the bedside, as hospice folks only come once in a while. And there aren't things to do. What can you fill that time with that feels up to the task? Stories are always good. Music, laughter, tears. The things that have a richness in life always have a place in a room. And as we are here in this room, we who are chronically mortal, what can we spend our days on in these brief moments we are here? What could you spend your days on that would not enrage in its triviality? Hope, things of deep purpose. Most of the things I worry about, probably not so much. And probably all the things that flash on my phone. But actions of love and kindness, work of justice, vulnerability. Love seems worth it. A way to fill the time. So I was 24 years old when I started as a hospice chaplain. I was in seminary, and I just had a terrible semester at school. Everything seemed pretty much terrible, and I was disillusioned with church, academics, you name it. And after being turned down for several jobs in a row, I'd heard about a space opening up in a clinical pastoral education program, training to be a pastor, but you did your clinical hours with hospice. And when you're feeling down, what is better than to sit at the bedside of the dying? And to be honest, It was. The folks who've been in hospice work for some time can tell you that there is a weight of grief to carry around, but actually being around those who are close to death wasn't the hard part. Because I knew it mattered what happened in that room. In a way that the focus tunnels onto just what is the one most important. How can we be present together? How can you fill this time with something that matters? What are words that can hold a room like that? And so I was chaplain in training, and I was there with a man who was close to death, and we were waiting for the family to arrive, and there was not nursing staff there, and so it was just finally a quiet moment, and I just was there in the room with him. And so I held his hand, and I prayed with him that his spirit would depart in peace. And it did. He let out his last breath as I was holding his hand there. And I was amazed. My understandings of life and death may have continued from there, but I haven't lost that reverence, that awe, that sense, how can we as mortals be in spaces like this together? Because we are, after all, each of us no less a miracle than the day we were born. Each of us here was held in the arms of someone who beheld with wonder our first breath. And how amazing it is that you exist, you breathe within you the breath of God all day long. The hands that you have in front of you are the same ones that someone marveled at with their tiny, perfect nails. And how remarkable it is to conceive that each of us will also have a last breath. That we will, in fact, be revealed in all our vulnerability. That we are not our own. That we stand at the edge of a mystery we do not know and say that we are not our own, we belong to God. And if we can claim this truth at the edges of life, of birth and death, then perhaps that truth can claim us at our center. Whether living or dying, we belong to God. We do not live to ourselves, we do not die to ourselves. Whether we live or die, we belong to God. May we spend the time like we meant it. Amen.